The day started like any other. Julia stirred her coffee absent-mindedly at the kitchen island, half listening to the morning news playing in the background. The house was quiet, with Nathan already out for his early run and the kids still asleep upstairs. She reached for her laptop, intending to answer emails before heading to the office. But when she opened her inbox, a forwarded email from her assistant caught her eye. The subject line read, "Urgent. Change in ownership filing?" Julia blinked. Ownership filing? Curious and slightly uneasy, she clicked it open. Attached was a scanned document filed with the State Business Registry, listing a transfer of 40% company shares from Julia Bennett to a corporate entity called Bray Capital Holdings. Her name and signature were right there on the last page. It was stamped, filed, and certified. For a few seconds, she just stared at the screen, her heartbeat pulsing louder than the television behind her. This had to be a mistake. She never signed anything like this. And who was Bray Capital Holdings? She grabbed her phone and called Nathan. He didn't pick up. She dialed again, pacing the kitchen now. Still no answer. Julia's mind reeled. She prided herself on being involved in every major decision of the company they built together. Harvest Table Company, a boutique line of organic sauces, dressings, and condiments that had grown into a regional powerhouse over the last decade. She and Nathan had poured every ounce of themselves into the business. They were equal partners, on paper and in spirit. Or so she thought. With her nerves tightening, she forwarded the document to their longtime corporate attorney, Helen Marks. Then she called her directly. "Julia, slow down," Helen said gently, 20 minutes later. "Yes, the document is legally filed. Yes, it appears to transfer your shares. But I need to look more closely at the power of attorney used to execute this." "Power of attorney?" Julia repeated. Helen hesitated. "This filing references a POA dated March 2020. It says you granted Nathan authority to act on your behalf regarding corporate matters." Julia's mouth went dry. March 2020, the beginning of the pandemic. She vaguely remembered signing something back then, when she was bedridden with pneumonia and Nathan needed to handle a few urgent tax filings. But she was certain it was limited. "Not this. I never gave him permission to sell my shares," she said, her voice trembling with a mixture of disbelief and rage. "I believe you," Helen said. "But the question now is whether we can prove this was beyond the scope of that POA. Do you still have the original?" "No idea," Julia whispered. "Nathan probably has it." That was when the nausea hit her. The laptop screen still glowed with the copy of the sale agreement. Her own name stared back at her, forged in confident strokes that mimicked her handwriting with disturbing accuracy. If she hadn't known better, she might have believed she'd signed it herself. She closed the laptop, feeling the weight of betrayal crash into her chest like a tidal wave. When Nathan returned home an hour later, sweaty from his run and humming to himself, Julia was waiting in the living room. She didn't rise to greet him. "Hey, Jules," he said, toweling off his neck. "Everything okay?" Her eyes stayed locked on him. "Did you sell my shares?" Nathan froze. For a second, he looked like a deer caught in headlights. Then his expression morphed into something colder, more practiced. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said. "Don't lie to me." He sighed and tossed the towel onto a chair. "Look, I didn't want to bring this up yet. It was complicated. The business needed an investor. You've been so busy with the creative side, I didn't want to burden you." "You forged my signature," she said, cutting him off. His jaw tightened. "It wasn't forged. I used the power of attorney you gave me. That was for filing taxes, Nathan. You know damn well I never gave you authority to transfer my ownership in the company." He didn't respond immediately. Instead, he walked over to the bar cart and poured himself a glass of water, as if that might buy him time. "We were drowning in logistics costs," he said finally. "Lucas Bray came in with a clean investment proposal. He wanted a 40% stake. You weren't around to talk about it, so I used what I had. You sold my half of our life's work behind my back," she said slowly. "Do you hear how insane that is?" "Julia, be reasonable," he snapped. "You've been pulling away from the business for months. You barely look at the financials anymore. You've been focused on branding, the cookbook, your influencer meetings." She stood up. "Don't you dare try to twist this. I've been working just as hard as you." You just didn't like that the business started being identified with me more than you. He turned away. Who the hell is Lucas Bray? She demanded. Why didn't you tell me? Because I knew you'd react like this. That sealed it. Julia grabbed her keys and walked past him without another word. If she stayed, she'd scream. Or worse, break something. She needed air, distance, and a plan. That afternoon, she sat in Helen's office, holding a cup of untouched tea. Helen had pulled up the original POA and was already combing through the legal language. You were right, Helen said grimly. This was limited in scope. He never had the authority to make a sale like this under it. Julia's shoulders tensed with a small flicker of hope. So I can undo it? It's not that simple. The deal's already closed. Lucas Bray is a third-party buyer. If he acted in good faith, the law will likely protect him. You'd have to sue Nathan directly and try to prove abuse of authority or fraud. But that could take years. Julia stared out the window. She didn't want a court battle. She wanted her company back. Or, at the very least, she wanted control again, on her terms. Do you know anything about Bray? She asked. Helen tapped her pen. He's a private equity investor based in Connecticut. Owns several food and beverage brands. Not the worst guy in the industry, but known for being aggressive. If you want to talk to him, I can arrange a meeting. Julia hesitated for a moment, then nodded. Set it up. 2 days later, she walked into a glassy conference room on the 34th floor of a Manhattan high-rise. Lucas Bray stood to greet her. He was younger than she expected, maybe 40, with sleek hair and a carefully curated casual look that screamed calculated wealth. He shook her hand firmly, his expression unreadable. I've been expecting this, he said, gesturing for her to sit. Julia stayed standing. Then I'll get to the point. My husband sold you something he had no right to sell. I read the POA, Lucas said. My legal team cleared it. I'm not in the business of shady deals, Miss Bennett. Be that as it may, I was never consulted. And now I'm out of my own company, watching it change under someone else's vision. Lucas tilted his head. Your husband said you were stepping back, that you were mentally exhausted. Julia laughed bitterly. What I am is the reason that brand has any public recognition at all. You bought a company based on my work, my face, my ideas. Lucas remained silent for a beat. She took a breath. I'm not here to threaten you, Mr. Bray, but I am here to make something clear. You may have bought 40% of a business, but you didn't buy me. And I intend to show you, very publicly, what I'm capable of when I'm pushed out of something I helped build. With that, she turned and walked out. As the elevator descended, her phone buzzed with a message from her old marketing director, who had recently left the company for another food startup. You have a minute to talk? Got an idea I think you'll love. Julia stared at the message, then smiled faintly to herself. The war had begun, and this time, she wasn't playing nice. The next morning, Julia stood at her home office window, watching the rain slide down the glass in long, crooked streaks. She hadn't slept much. Her thoughts churned like a storm. Loops of Nathan's betrayal, Lucas Bray's blank stare, and the realization that the company she had poured a decade of her life into now belonged, at least in part, to two men who had made decisions without her. But Julia wasn't the type to break. She was the type to regroup, recalibrate, and strike back with precision. She flipped open her leather notebook and began writing 2 lists. One was titled Assets I Still Control, and the other Assets They Don't Understand. The first included her name, her personal brand, the public-facing image she had built through media appearances, interviews, and her fast-growing social media presence as the face behind From Harvest to Table. The second list was more complex: relationships with clients, insider knowledge of operations, staff loyalty, suppliers, proprietary marketing strategies, and dozens of small but significant brand choices only she could explain. Then she wrote a third list: leverage points. Julia knew she couldn't win this in a courtroom, at least not quickly. Nathan had technically exploited a loophole. The damage was done. But what she could do was uncover how it was done and use that information to take control in the arena she knew best: influence, reputation, and strategy. She called someone she hadn't spoken to in months, Gabriel Levin, a forensic accountant she'd worked with on a previous brand acquisition project. Gabriel was blunt, brilliant, and deeply familiar with the kind of financial acrobatics small companies often attempted to hide. "Julia Bennett," he said, picking up after 2 rings. "You must be calling for something dirty. You never call unless there's smoke." "More like a 5-alarm fire," she replied. "I need to trace the paper trail of a private sale involving my shares in Harvest Table Company." Gabriel chuckled. "Tell me everything." She filled him in quickly. Nathan's use of an old power of attorney, the forged signature, the sale to Bray Capital. She forwarded him the documentation she had, including the suspicious POA. "Give me 48 hours, he said. "I'll see what I can dig up." Julia spent those 2 days laying quiet groundwork. She visited 3 of her most loyal clients, regional retailers who had built trust with her over the years, and asked pointed questions about any changes they'd seen in the past 2 months. One buyer admitted they'd been approached by a different account manager than usual, and that new packaging proposals were being pitched without Julia's involvement. Another said Nathan had emailed directly to assure them Julia was stepping down for personal reasons. That phrase again, stepping down. It made her skin crawl. She asked her contacts to keep her looped in discreetly and not to mention her inquiries. Most nodded, clearly surprised and even slightly disturbed. Julia had been the face they trusted. The sudden shift didn't sit right with them. When she returned home, Gabriel had already sent an encrypted file with his findings. She sat at her desk, opened her laptop, and clicked the link. Gabriel's voice played first. It was a voice note embedded into the file. "Julia, you were right to call. There's some interesting stuff here. First off, the POA Nathan used? It was supposed to expire after the 2020 tax cycle. You had a clause in there, clear as day, limiting it to specific routine filings and nothing to do with sale or transfer of ownership. What you did might not hold up under scrutiny." She paused the audio, feeling a small knot loosen in her chest. "But wait, it gets better," Gabriel continued when she resumed it. "The sale contract was executed with a timestamp that predates the board's recorded meeting by 2 weeks, which means Nathan signed off on a deal before there was any formal approval from the company's governance structure. That's a breach of protocol at the very least, and potentially fraudulent representation if pushed hard enough." Julia leaned forward, her mind racing. "Can I use this?" she murmured to herself. Gabriel's voice answered her, almost like he heard her question. "If you're trying to reverse the deal, it'll take time. If you're trying to apply pressure, this might be enough to rattle Bray. I also found a series of wire transfers from Nathan's personal account to an unknown shell company, 2 weeks before the deal closed. Might be nothing, might be something." She sat in silence for a while, letting the implications settle. Nathan had gone behind her back, yes, but now she had something that could potentially expose not just a betrayal of trust, but financial misconduct. And while Lucas Bray might claim innocence, no investor likes surprises. Julia picked up her phone and dialed Helen. "I need you to draft a formal letter," she said, "to Bray Capital Holdings. I want them to know I've uncovered documentation that suggests the share transfer was built on procedural violations and unauthorized power of attorney use. Make it sound serious, but not litigious yet. I want them to feel cornered, not attacked." Helen's tone was instantly alert. "You're playing this smart. Want me to copy Nathan?" "No. Let Bray tell him. Let him wonder what else I've found." That night, Julia stood on the back porch, a glass of wine in hand, looking out at the garden she rarely had time to enjoy. The air was heavy with early summer moisture, and the scent of lavender carried in the breeze. Her phone buzzed again, this time from an unknown number. She answered cautiously. "Miss Bennett," the voice said, clipped and professional. "This is Marcia Thorne. I'm Mr. Bray's legal counsel. He received your letter." "Good," Julia said evenly. "He's open to a conversation. He'd like to resolve this without escalation." "I'm listening." "There may be an opportunity for strategic realignment," Marcia said carefully. "Perhaps involving your return to an executive position. Conditional, of course." "Conditional on what?" "Mr. Bray is concerned about reputational damage, should any of this information reach the press or industry stakeholders. He values discretion." Julia let the silence stretch. "Tell him I'm happy to talk, but the next meeting happens on my terms. In my office, and I'm not coming back to sit quietly in the corner." "Understood." She hung up, heart thudding. Not from nerves, but from the unmistakable pulse of momentum shifting. Nathan may have blindsided her with his arrogance and deceit, but she wasn't done. Far from it. The following morning, Julia called in a favor from someone she once mentored, Caroline Vega, now an investigative business journalist with a respected online publication. Over coffee, Julia laid out the story, not for immediate publication, but to remind everyone that she still had access, voice, and options. "I'm not asking for a headline," Julia said. "Not yet. But if the time comes and I decide to speak, would you run it?" Caroline didn't hesitate. "With this kind of documentation, it'll trend in hours." Julia smiled. That's all I needed to know. Then, in an unassuming corner of her notebook, she wrote the words that would guide her next step. Control isn't always taken. Sometimes it's reclaimed. And underneath, she drew an arrow that pointed to a single word: strategy. Because if Nathan had taught her anything, it was that marriage contracts could be breached, but business warfare was another level entirely, and she had just begun to sharpen her weapons. Julia walked through the doors of the tall brick building with a quiet sense of determination that felt both foreign and familiar. This wasn't Harvest Table's headquarters. No glossy walls adorned with framed press clippings or shelves lined with their best-selling jars. This was something new, raw, real. The co-working space she entered wasn't glamorous, but it had energy, humming with the momentum of young startups, solo founders, and consultants hammering out deals over espresso and Wi-Fi. She didn't need polish. She needed focus. Power. She set down her leather bag, opened her laptop, and logged into the shared drive she'd created the night before. Onto her files she'd curated over the past 3 weeks: strategic brand documents, supplier contacts, former campaign materials, and the personal notes she'd always kept separate from company servers. She never imagined how vital her private archive would become. Her phone buzzed. "Lucas Bray, received your email. We'll respond later today." She stared at the message for a moment, then turned her attention back to the screen. She had something more important to focus on now: her meeting with Matthew Gold, the CEO of her competitor. Matthew arrived 10 minutes later, all-navy suit and understated charisma. He'd launched Forager Roots 5 years ago, a startup with a small but growing presence in the artisanal food world. They were agile, hungry, and under-resourced. Julia knew their branding had potential, but it lacked coherence. That's where she came in. She greeted him with a firm handshake and gestured to the table she'd booked. "I've admired what you've built," Julia began, straight to the point. "You've got excellent distribution, good shelf positioning, and a solid product, but your story is a mess." Matthew raised an eyebrow. "That's not how most people start a pitch." "I'm not most people." She laid out a 10-slide presentation, sleek and simple, explaining exactly how Forager Roots could reposition itself in the next 6 months to steal key market share from Harvest Table. Not just through branding, but by anticipating the moves Lucas and Nathan would make before they made them. "I'm offering you insight they can't match," Julia said calmly. "I know the buyer preferences. I know their weaknesses. More importantly, I know what makes that brand work, and what'll make it crumble." Matthew leaned back in his chair, clearly impressed. "What do you want?" "I want a partner as a brand strategist and interim CMO. Short-term, performance-based contract. I don't want a desk. I want results. You implement the plan, and I'll give you 6 months of dominance. And what happens after 6 months? I decide if I want to build something of my own or help you scale this nationally." Matthew didn't even hesitate. "Send me the paperwork." By the end of the day, Julia had signed her contract, hired a graphic designer she'd worked with on her last cookbook, and brought in her former marketing assistant, Claudia, who had jumped ship from Harvest Table 2 months earlier due to creative differences with Nathan. "I knew he'd mess it up," Claudia said as she settled into the desk beside Julia's. "I just didn't expect it to happen this fast." Over the next few weeks, Julia buried herself in work. The media coverage surrounding Harvest Table's rebranding rollout under Lucas Bray had begun. A series of clean, minimalist ads appeared online, visually sharp but emotionally hollow. Gone were the warm tones, the rustic familiarity, the personal touch of storytelling that Julia had spent years crafting. Bray had hired a New York-based agency to modernize the brand. In doing so, he'd stripped it of its soul. Julia saw an opportunity. She launched a campaign for Forager Roots called The Real Table, featuring unscripted interviews with local farmers, chefs, and families who use their products. It was raw, genuine, and packed with sensory details. Everything Bray's version of Harvest Table now lacked. Her tagline, "You don't need perfect, you need real," began trending across food bloggers and influencers. Within a month, Forager Roots saw a 23% increase in social engagement and a 17% spike in direct-to-consumer sales. Buyers started calling. The board wanted to shift. That caught her attention. "I'll consider it," she said, "but not as a consultant. I'm not coming back as the voice behind someone else's decisions." "What do you want?" She didn't answer immediately. Small ones at first, independents and farm-to-table markets, but then came the mid-tier grocery chains. Julia made it a point to personally visit each buyer, not with flashy presentations, but with sincerity and deep knowledge. She spoke to their shelves, their customer behavior, their seasonal pain points. No one from Harvest Table had done that in months. She was building a reputation again, this time not as a co-founder writing a legacy, but as the strategist with the golden touch. One evening, as Julia wrapped up a call with a West Coast distributor, her phone lit up with a new message. "Lucas Bray, we need to talk. Call me tomorrow." She smiled faintly and closed the laptop. Let him wait. The next day, she called Lucas from a quiet conference room. "I've seen what you're doing," Lucas said without preamble, "and I'd like to propose a new arrangement." Julia said nothing. "I'm considering selling part of my stake, or at least bringing you back in as an equity partner, officially. I'm listening. You're the only person who knows how to steady the brand. The numbers aren't terrible, but engagement is dropping. Retailers are getting nervous, and I think we both know you didn't deserve to be sidelined." Julia's voice was cool and clear. "I didn't just get sidelined, Lucas. I got erased, which I'd like to undo. Look, Nathan's on his way out. We've had differences. Then, you'll get my terms by the end of the week." After hanging up, she stared at the ceiling for a long while. She knew this was her moment, but it had to be played precisely. She wasn't sure yet if she wanted back in, or if she just wanted to watch it burn. Later that evening, Claudia brought over a brown envelope. "This came to your old P.O. box. Looks important." Inside was a manila folder marked confidential. Julia opened it carefully and found a series of printed emails between Nathan and Lucas dated months before the deal officially closed. One exchange detailed Nathan's concerns about Julia's growing visibility and need for control, along with his recommendation to remove her before she disrupted long-term scalability. At the bottom of the thread, Lucas replied, "I'll proceed with the acquisition, but only if she's no longer a decision-maker by Q2. Julia's blood chilled. She now had written proof that her removal hadn't been incidental. It had been part of the deal. She took a photo of the exchange and forwarded it to Helen with a single line, "Add this to the file." We're not done yet. That weekend, Julia flew to Chicago to speak at a food industry conference. Her name still carried weight, and the keynote spot had been offered months earlier. She almost canceled, but as she stepped onto the stage in front of 800 attendees, she realized it was exactly what she needed. She spoke not just about food or branding, but about betrayal, reinvention, and ownership. She didn't name names. She didn't have to. The subtext was clear. Your work is your legacy. If someone tries to steal it, make sure they regret underestimating you. The standing ovation was thunderous. In the front row, a journalist from Food Brand Weekly took notes feverishly. The headline 2 days later, "Julia Bennett proves you can lose everything and still win." The sun spilled through the tall windows of Julia's rented office, casting long golden slats across the floor. Her desk, now organized with precision and purpose, held everything she needed. A stack of neatly bound contracts, her laptop displaying the final version of a proposal, and the envelope containing the damning emails between Nathan and Lucas. She sat motionless for a moment, just listening to the quiet hum of the morning. Her mind wasn't racing anymore. It was aligned, sharp, clear, and unshakably calm. Today was the day. Julia wasn't just returning to Harvest Table. She was about to walk into a meeting where every illusion Nathan had crafted would begin to unravel. Not in chaos, not in anger, but with deliberate, surgical precision. At 10 a.m. sharp, she walked into the conference room on the 17th floor of Bray Capital's Midtown office. Lucas Bray was already seated, flanked by his counsel, Marcia Thorne, and a young associate scribbling into a notepad. Nathan, noticeably more gaunt and less confident than usual, stood near the window with a forced smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Julia," Lucas said, gesturing to the seat across from him. "Thank you for coming." She nodded once, took her seat, and placed a thin leather folder on the table. "No pleasantries. No small talk. I received your offer," she began. "I reviewed the terms carefully. But before we go any further, I'd like to clarify something." Lucas exchanged a look with Marcia, but nodded. "I know the real reason my shares were sold," Julia said calmly. "And I know it wasn't an accident or a misunderstanding. It was a calculated move, orchestrated by my husband and approved by you." Nathan tensed. "Julia, come on." She slid the printed email chain across the table. "You both agreed I was a liability to the business. You planned my removal to make the acquisition smoother." Lucas didn't deny it. He glanced at the pages, then slowly folded his hands. "That was Nathan's recommendation, yes. I trusted his judgment at the time. And you built the rebranding strategy without me," she continued. "Now it's failing, because you assumed the business was about margins and market reach. But this brand was built on story, on trust, on personal relationships, something you and Nathan never understood." The room fell silent. Lucas broke first. "So what are you asking for?" Julia opened her folder and pulled out a new proposal. "Here are my terms for returning to Harvest Table as majority stakeholder." Nathan's mouth fell open. "Majority? You're out of your mind." She didn't look at him. Her gaze stayed locked on Lucas. "You'll sell me 21% of the company at the current devalued rate. That gives me 61%. I become chair of the board and CEO. You retain a minority position if you wish, but you're out of decision-making." Nathan relinquishes all titles and sells his remaining shares at a reduced rate as part of the separation agreement. "I want full creative and operational control." Marcia leaned forward. "That's a hostile takeover." "No," Julia said, voice cool. "It's a rescue mission." Lucas ran a hand through his hair, visibly agitated. "Your campaign against us cost us revenue. You undercut your own company. I built a parallel brand that succeeded where yours failed," she corrected. "And I did it in 6 weeks. I didn't undercut Harvest Table. I reminded the market what it's missing." "You're bluffing." Julia smiled. "I'm not," she said. "And I'll give you until the end of the day to decide. After that, I go public. I share the story, the emails, the forged documents. And I continue scaling forger routes. Your brand value drops another 30% by next quarter. Maybe more." Lucas sat back, calculating. He was a businessman. He didn't deal in emotion. He dealt in numbers. And Julia knew he saw the math now, clearly and coldly. Nathan was a liability. She was an asset. "I'll need to consult the board," he said at last. "I've already spoken to 2 board members," Julia said. "They're ready to vote. The others will follow." Lucas exhaled. "Then we'll draft the transfer documents. But I want indemnity, no lawsuits." "You'll get it," she said, assuming full cooperation. She stood, closed her folder, and looked at Nathan for the first time. He looked defeated. There was no anger in her voice when she spoke. "You tried to erase me," she said softly. "But you forgot who I was before all of this. I built something from nothing. I trusted you to protect it with me. You didn't just betray me. You underestimated me." Nathan opened his mouth as if to respond, but nothing came out. Julia turned and walked out of the room without another word. The following weeks were a whirlwind of transitions. The press release was brief but effective. Julia Bennett returns to lead Harvest Table Company as CEO and chairwoman, following strategic realignment. Internally, the restructuring moved quickly. Nathan sold his shares quietly and disappeared from the company's narrative. Lucas retained a 10% position and stepped down from daily operations. Julia reassembled her original core team. Claudia, the former operations manager, her longtime food photographer, and a group of supplier contacts who were thrilled to work with her again. She held her first executive meeting in the same boardroom she once helped design, a room Nathan had tried to lock her out of. Now, the head seat was hers. "I don't want apologies," she said to the assembled team. "I want action. We're going back to what made this company different: authenticity. We'll keep expanding, but we're going to do it with integrity, not ego." The team erupted in applause. By the end of the quarter, the numbers spoke for themselves. Revenues climbed back, customer retention improved, and social media engagement doubled. Retailers who had expressed hesitation began placing larger orders again. Food magazines reached out for interviews, and Julia returned to the public eye, not as a victim, but as a force. She received a package one day, a single, anonymous envelope. Inside was a handwritten note. "You were always better than me. I just never had the courage to admit it. I hope, someday, you can forgive me." And she stared at it for a long time, then folded it and placed it in the bottom drawer of her desk. Not to forget, but to remind herself never to doubt her instincts again. Months later, she found herself on stage again, this time accepting an industry leadership award. As she looked out at the audience, she thought of the night she'd sat alone on her porch, clutching a glass of wine, feeling everything she'd built slipping through her fingers. Now, her grip was stronger than ever. She ended her speech with a single line that brought the entire room to its feet. The lesson isn't just about betrayal. It's about remembering who you are when someone tries to write you out of your own story. And taking the pen back, Julia walked off stage, into the bright lights, and into the next chapter of her life. Not as someone's wife, not as someone's partner, but as a woman who had reclaimed what was hers and proved without a shadow of doubt who the real business person in the family truly was.